This is my third unboxing video, though in this case less of an unboxing than an envelope opening. As with all of these previous unboxings, I do not know exactly what the item is before I open it on camera. So let's get stuck in. Many thanks to Jonathan Stern of Damascus, Pennsylvania for very kindly sending me this mystery package. Well, this is interesting. Reading the accompanying letter, these are genuine World War II insignia, and this one will undoubtedly be familiar to regular viewers of this channel, as several years ago I made a video about the Russian Liberation Army, a collaborationist unit of former Soviet POWs that joined the German army under the command of renegade Red Army General Andrei Vlasov. I'll link the video in the end screen. The second insignia is obviously for another Osttruppen Legion, as the Germans called them, this time formed from Soviet POWs and anti-communist émigrés from the Soviet Republic of Georgia, Georgia also being the birthplace of Stalin. The German armed forces recruited widely, and I mean really widely. Not only all European nations, including the neutral ones such as Spain, Switzerland and Sweden, had their own units in the German armed forces, particularly the SS, but non-Europeans were well represented, with soldiers from India, North Africa and the Middle East. The Germans looked for common cause. Some national or ethnic groups supported the Germans because they wanted freedom from another group. The recruitment of Bosnian Muslims in German-occupied Yugoslavia is an excellent example, as the Muslim minority looked to the Germans to protect them from the Croatian Ustasha fascists and Tito's communists. The Soviet Union proved to be a very fertile recruiting area for the Germans, and millions of Soviet prisoners of war ended up in German uniform. For example, the Cossacks detested Stalin's genocidal policies, and many Ukrainians thought the Germans would give them independence after pushing out the communists. This patch has inspired me to make a program about an event in the Netherlands in 1945 known as the Texel Uprising that concerned the Georgian Legion. Before we move to the main story, let's examine briefly the patch. This is an unused sleeve shield, and the soldier would snip this out and then stitch it to the upper right sleeve of his German army tunic. This is the second type made of a silkscreen printed process. The Georgian Legion was an interesting organization. The Georgians received different treatment from other Soviet groups from the Germans, who considered Georgians to be Aryans rather than Slavs or Asians. The primary reason for this different treatment was because Nazi ideologue and Reichsminister for the occupied Eastern Territories, Dr. Alfred Rosenberg, had amongst his close advisors several Georgian exiles. Soviet POWs of Georgian nationality and overseas anti-communist émigré Georgians joined the Georgian Legion in quite large numbers, with in total some 30,000 Georgians serving the Germans, primarily in the belief that the Germans would restore Georgian independence from the Soviet Union. Georgia had been progressively annexed by the Tsars starting in 1801, and following the Russian Revolution in 1917 had briefly been independent again under German protection. However, in 1921, the Red Army had invaded and annexed Georgia to the USSR, becoming a Soviet Socialist Republic. The interesting point was, although the Germans managed to penetrate fairly far into the Soviet Union in 1941–42, they never reached Georgia. The recruits came mostly from German POW camps, hundreds of thousands of Georgians serving in the wider Red Army. In December 1941, the Georgian Legion was formed and would eventually number 13 infantry battalions. Several officers who had served in the briefly independent Georgian army between 1918 and 21 also joined and were given command positions. But a large cadre of German officers and NCOs were attached to each battalion to oversee its administration. Hitler personally was highly mistrustful of the Osttruppen, believing them to be unreliable and potentially traitorous. And this suspicion was indeed played out numerous times in cases of desertions by ex-Soviet troops, by Osttruppen to anti-German resistance organizations across Europe. However, due to German manpower problems, the Osttruppen were often used to free up regular German forces from occupation and guard duties, and this is what happened to the 882nd Infantry Battalion Queen Tamar of the Georgian Legion that had been formed in Poland in June 1943 and had initially been used to fight partisans in the German rear areas on the Eastern Front. On the 24th of August 1943, the battalion was transferred to Western Europe, to Zandvoort in the Netherlands, relieving the 950th Regiment of the Free India Legion, probably Hitler's most exotic foreign legion. The Georgians would remain at Zandvoort from September 1943 until February 1945 on coastal defence and general garrison duties. Then, on the 6th of February 1945, the battalion was transferred to the island of Texel. It is written as Texel, but is pronounced Texel in Dutch. Texel is the largest and most populated of the West Frisian Islands, north of Den Helder. Part of the Atlantic Wall defences, Texel was full of German naval gun batteries and bunker systems. The Georgians were to provide the infantry elements to help garrison the island and also help to construct further defences. However, word was received in late March 1945 that several of the unit's companies would be shortly transferred to the Dutch mainland to fight the advancing British and Canadian forces, not something the Georgians were interested in doing. The leaders of the 882nd Battalion had been for some time in contact with the local Dutch resistance, and the leader of the revolt that followed was Second Lieutenant Loladze, a former captain in the Red Army Air Force and a squadron commander who had been shot down over Ukraine and taken prisoner. Lieutenant Loladze, who was aged 29, had heard rumours that an Allied landing was also to be made on Texel, though this never actually occurred. Anyway, the Georgians planned to rise up and take over the island, handing it over to the British once they landed. It would be a good way to ingratiate themselves with the Western Allies. This proved to be a major error on the plotters' side. Although the battalion numbered several hundred Georgians, it also had 400 or so German officers and men attached to it, including, of course, the commanding officer, Major Klaus Breitner, and the first thing the Georgians planned to do was to eliminate these German advisors and staff. On the night of the 5th to 6th of April 1945, just over a month before the end of the war in Europe, the Georgians struck, killing some 180 German soldiers in their quarters or at their posts. However, crucially, they failed to kill all of the Germans, and they also failed to capture the fortified naval batteries on the islands, and they managed to defend themselves, and also, of course, raise the alarm at higher headquarters on the mainland. Even though the Third Reich was on its knees by April 1945, the northwestern Netherlands was still garrisoned by sizable and capable German forces, and one of these, the 163rd Naval Security Regiment, some 2,000 men strong, was dispatched to quash the rebellion and kill the Georgians. The Germans were extremely angry that 180 German soldiers had been murdered in cold blood by the turncoat Georgians, and they were out for revenge. The commanding officer of the 882nd Battalion, Major Breitner, in particular, demanded that no mercy be shown to any Georgians that fell into German hands. The German naval batteries began bombarding Georgian positions on the island as companies of the 167th Naval Regiment landed. The battle for Texel raged for 5 weeks, continuing even after the Germans' surrender in Europe, as German naval troops rooted out Georgian renegades and destroyed Georgian fortified positions, causing enormous physical damage to Dutch settlements on the island and a large loss of life among civilians. The Georgians fought particularly to defend the north of the island, an area called Ireland. German forces showed no mercy to any Georgians that they took alive. Major Breitner ordered that they be summarily executed for mutiny. Captured Georgians were forced to dig their own graves, then ordered to remove their German uniforms before being shot. The German operation to destroy the Georgian Legion was ongoing when the German forces capitulated in the Netherlands and Denmark on the 4th of May 1945. It continued beyond Germany's complete surrender on the 8th of May, and continued until the 17th of May 1945, when Canadian forces finally arrived on Texel to end the fighting and disarm the German garrison, making the battle raging there one of the last battles of World War II in Europe. Casualties on all sides had been heavy. 812 Germans were dead, either killed during the initial uprising or died during the long battle that followed. 565 Georgians were killed in action or executed following capture, and 120 civilians also died on Texel. The surviving 228 Georgians, many having been hidden by sympathetic Dutch civilians, were taken into Allied custody. However, according to the terms of the 1943 Yalta Agreement, Soviet citizens captured in German uniform by the Western Allies had to be returned to Soviet jurisdiction, and although not applied in many cases, notably that of the Ukrainian SS, linked to my video in the end screen, most Soviet citizens were repatriated to the tender mercies of Stalin and his NKVD secret police. The 228 Georgians were sent back to the USSR, and 26 were specially sent with their families to the Gulag. Later, the Soviet government considered the Georgians' rising to have been a patriotic act, and the Georgians were released from prison in the 1950s, and the USSR paid for a memorial to the Georgians on Texel, which is still there to this day. As for Georgia, it would become an independent republic once again at the fall of the Soviet Union. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon, details in the description box below.